Subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon for all updates. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Sneha Banerjee and today I'm going to talk about how to start reading poetry and how to focus more on poems and understanding the beauty of poetry. Okay, so without any further delay, let's get started with this topic. Now, the tips and tricks that I'm going to share with you are something that worked for me. It is from my personal experience because even I was not really a reader of poetry. I didn't used to read a lot of poems. I was mostly about reading stories and novels, but then eventually I started reading poems as well, and today I read a lot of poetry, and I think that is really pretty fantastic because the things that I have learned from poems, I think I wouldn't have learned that anywhere else. Okay, so the first advice that I want to give you is that if you are a beginner, then please don't start reading poems by classic poets or poets from the Victorian era. Now, why I am saying this? It's because classic poems are traditional poems, and traditional poetry is very structured, it's very rule driven, and it has its own technicalities. So if you don't understand all those things, then you will not get its entire flavor. And those poems have a depth that might not be very relatable to you right now. Especially if the poems are from the Victorian era, then it will not be relatable to you at all, because the problems and the issues that people dealt in Victorian era completely reflected in their poems and in their novels. So if you want to start reading poems and if you want to grow a genuine interest in poems, you have to start with something that is relatable and that is not very difficult for you to understand right now. And I'm telling you this from my own experience because I also picked some of the most beautiful classic poems and I couldn't understand those. What happened is that I actually left reading poetry, but then eventually I understood that that's not really the best way to start reading poetry, because if you actually start your reading journey from the advanced poems, you will not be able to sustain this for a long time. So if not classic poets, then what should you read? I will suggest you to start reading contemporary poems written by contemporary poets. Now, what is contemporary poetry? There are different definitions, but mainly contemporary poetry is written in free verse. That is, it's very freestyle, it's written very freely. There is no boundary to it, there are no particular rules, or it is not very structured. And that is one of the best things about it, that it is very accessible to the common reader. So even if you are not an advanced reader, you will be able to understand contemporary poetry very easily, since I told you there are not many technicalities to it. It is very free, it doesn't have to rhyme every now and then, it has its own rhythm. Like line after line, it's written in such a lyrical way that it has its own rhythm, but it doesn't necessarily have to rhyme. We usually think that a poem is a poem only when it rhymes, but that's not really true, and that you will understand when you read contemporary poems. Contemporary poems are very reader oriented, so it's like you are reading the poem from your perspective, you are relating to it from the level of your own understanding. It's less about the poet and more about the reader. But on the other hand, what happens with classic poetry, you have to understand what the poet tries to portray. It's more about them, their life and their issues. So you have to understand the poet's mentality, you have to understand the issues that were going on in the era in which the poems were written. So it becomes very difficult and technical with classic poetry because it's so traditional. On the other hand, contemporary poetry is very lucid, it's very lyrical, and it's all about you. It's about you, how you relate with the poem from where you are. It's about your level of understanding and so reader oriented. So it becomes very easy, very accessible for everyone to understand and get into the flow of reading poetry for the long term. Okay, so the first thing now I will ask you is to follow Button Poetry everywhere. It's on YouTube, it's on Facebook, it's on Instagram. They have some of the greatest contemporary poets in their team who share their work and perform them. And to be honest, I think you should definitely follow them. My favorite is Rudy Francisco, and if you have not read his poems or if you have not seen him perform, then I think you are missing out on some of the most beautiful poems ever. So there is Rudy Francisco, Andre Gibson, Blythe Beard, Dana Smith. All these poets are amazing. Their poems are to die for, and the most best part about their poems is that they are very relatable and so up to date. Like, they talk about the issues that we are dealing with. It's about our era. Also, if you want to follow any Indian contemporary poet, then there is Megha Rao. Follow her on Facebook, Instagram. She also performed, and the video is on YouTube, so you can watch her perform and read her poems. She's stunning. Like the way she refers to all these different events from past and history, and then the metaphors that she uses, all of her poems are just so stunning. So if you want to follow some Indian poet, then you should definitely follow her. So now I told you where to start from, but how to start, like how to actually read and focus on poetry. So before reading, I will actually suggest you to go and watch them perform. All the videos are on YouTube and I'll give everything in the description below, so do not forget to check that out. So what happens is that when you see a poet perform their poetry, it gets very easy to understand it, because now you know how they are stopping at a comma or a semicolon, or what does that dash mean, how to read it. You get to learn that when you see them perform their poetry. So when you're reading it, you understand how to actually read it, and that makes you learn a lot about poetry. And I think that is one of the greatest advantages of reading or understanding contemporary poems, and that is the poets are performing their poems, so you get to understand how exactly they have expressed it. Also, you get to see their expression, you get to see how they're enunciating the words. It gets so much easy and you learn so much from them directly. Now when you actually sit down to read a poem, I will suggest that firstly go through the poem and see which words you don't know the meaning of. Write down the meaning beside the word. Maybe the meaning of the word might not actually resonate with the theme of the poem. That's okay. Sometimes words are used in a different way, so but you have to understand that when you read it. So first write down the meaning, so you don't have to resort to the dictionary every second. So when you're reading a poem, don't just read it in mind, read it out loud, and trust me, it has helped me a lot. I used to read poems in my mind and it didn't really have any effect on me, but when I actually started reading it out loud, I grew genuine interest in reading more poems. So you have to understand that poetry is different. It's a bit more complicated from basic writing. So if you're not being able to understand something, it's totally okay. You have to repeatedly read that line which you're not being able to understand. Maybe you're not understanding the true meaning of the metaphor or true meaning of a particular word. That's okay, but when you actually repeatedly read it, you understand the true flavor of it. You understand it in its entirety. So don't give up. You have to give some effort, because it's poetry after all. If you don't give an effort, how will you be able to get or absorb the true beauty of it? Poetry is a lifestyle. Once you start reading poetry, it sits down in your memory and it stays there forever. So to conclude, I will say that poetry is an inseparable part of literature, and if you're not reading it, then you're missing out on something very beautiful and something from which you can learn a lot. So poetry is something from which you can learn to express in a more beautiful and subtle manner. So sometimes you can just resort to plain words, right? But when you say that thing in a more poetic way, then it becomes so beautiful and more expressive. So poetry is an inseparable part of literature. If you want to understand and if you want to excel in literature, you have to resort to poetry. You cannot leave it. You cannot just miss out on it, because it is going to make you learn some of the most beautiful lessons of literature. It makes you learn the art of framing beautiful sentences, and that is something that you need in your future. Alright, so that was all that I had to tell you, and everything that I told you is from my own experience. And today, when I have read so many poems and I read poetry on a daily basis, I think all these advices I wanted someone to give to me, because my life would have gotten so much more easier. But it's okay, I learned from myself. Self-learning is the best thing. But I wanted to share my experience with you, and one of my subscribers actually suggested to make this video. I hope that it helped him. So alright, that was all for today, and if you liked my video and thought that it was helpful, then do not forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell icon since I post new videos every week, and I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.